John Wayne. The year was 1939, and John Wayne walked into Hollywood as the embodiment of rugged masculinity. At first glance, you'd think this guy was born to ride horses and stare down villains. But dig deeper, and you'll find something surprising. The man couldn't act. His dialogue delivery was wooden, his emotions as shallow as a puddle in a desert. Yet somehow this supposed wooden Indian became the face of American films. But it wasn't his acting that made him unforgettable. It was his sheer presence, his quiet authority, his magnetic persona, his ability to inspire. Directors used him as a symbol, not a performer. Wayne didn't need depth, he needed a hat and a gun. His lack of acting skill was his ticket to fame, proving that sometimes it's not talent, but the myth you create that shapes history. And as it turned out, those myths were a lot more powerful than acting chops. The next revelation will take us down a path of wholesomeness, or rather, its lack of it. Doris Day. Doris Day, the definition of wholesome. Her blonde curls, sweet smile, and the squeaky clean image of the 1950s. But here's the truth. They didn't call her the queen of the lovable blonde because she was a brilliant actress. No, her appeal was her likability, her ability to sell you a perfect, sugar-coated life on screen. She was a good singer, sure, but when it came to acting, Day's talent didn't always hold up under scrutiny. Her performances were often criticized for being too one-note, with emotional depth that never quite went beyond the surface. Still, Hollywood adored her, not for her skill, but for the fantasy she sold. There's a dark irony in this. A woman who built a career on portraying purity and joy had a personal life plagued by abusive marriages and mental turmoil. The surface of her films? Glistening. The truth beneath? Complex and tragic. And in some ways, that complexity is what allowed her to remain so beloved. And speaking of darkness hiding beneath perfection, let's talk about someone who kept secrets for a lifetime. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the quintessential American man, tall, handsome, and impossibly charming. His acting? Well, not so much. Critics and audiences alike agreed. Hudson had limited range. He was never going to win an Oscar for Best Actor. But here's where it gets interesting. Hudson became one of the most famous leading men of his time. Why? Because he was an illusion. The way he smiled at the camera, the way he held himself. It wasn't his acting that captivated people, it was his image. Rock Hudson became an icon not for the depth of his characters, but because of the perfect mask he wore. And here's the shocking twist. While Hollywood plastered his charming, heterosexual image across every screen, Hudson was hiding a secret. He was gay. And this secret didn't just change the way we see his career, it changed the entire game. Hudson's closeted life gives us a glimpse into the cost of fame, where the truth was something to be buried, even as his stardom soared. But not everyone can keep secrets forever, as we're about to see in the life of a star whose beauty wasn't enough to keep her hidden. Lana Turner. Lana Turner's beauty was legendary. But behind the blinding glamour, something darker lurked. Turner was a star who seemed to have it all: looks, fame, and a string of lovers. But her acting was often criticized as flat, unconvincing. Her iconic role in The Postman Always Rings Twice was more about her seductive allure than any emotional range. Still, the Hollywood machine knew what it was doing. They capitalized on her image, turning her into a sex symbol, someone whose looks were enough to sustain her career. But it was her personal life that would overshadow everything. Turner was at the center of one of the most shocking moments in Hollywood history, her 1958 trial for the murder of her abusive lover, Johnny Stompanato. The public was obsessed with her, not because of her acting, but because of the drama that followed her everywhere. The ultimate irony? Despite being a woman with a tragic and complex life, the Hollywood machine cared little for her soul, just her image. Speaking of personas that were more important than talent, let's dive into a life built on secrets and smiles. Tab Hunter. Tab Hunter was the classic 1950s heartthrob, blonde, clean-cut, and as American as apple pie. But let's be honest, the guy couldn't act his way out of a paper bag. Yet somehow, he became a household name, gracing the cover of every teen magazine and starring in films like Battle Cry. But what made him truly fascinating wasn't his acting, it was the truth he hid. Behind the smile and the studio-crafted persona, Hunter was gay, a fact he kept hidden for years in an industry that demanded silence. His secret was kept tightly under wraps, and his publicist went to great lengths to fabricate a straight image. But his story isn't just about fame. It's about survival in an industry where talent often took a back seat to marketability. And what makes his story even more compelling is how he eventually told the truth, later in life, revealing himself in a memoir. The man who had been Hollywood's perfect golden boy was far more complex than anyone had imagined. This brings us to another star who was the product of fantasy, and reality was a much messier place. Esther Williams. Esther Williams wasn't an actress. She was an Olympic swimmer who became a movie star because Hollywood wanted to sell an image of perfection, an image that had little to do with actual acting. Williams' films, like Bathing Beauty, were built around her ability to swim, not her acting ability. Hollywood created an entire genre for her, the aquatic musical. She didn't have to act. She had to glide through water like a goddess. And she did that perfectly. But here's the kicker. Behind the water and the smile, Williams had a career that wasn't quite as graceful. Her acting was stiff, her emotions forced, and her roles often uninspired. Yet she was beloved, not for her acting, but for the spectacle she provided. The movies didn't care about her skill. They cared about the fantasy she represented. This brings us to someone who used charm as his greatest weapon, someone whose film roles were unforgettable, even if his acting wasn't. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis had the look, the smoldering eyes and the slicked back hair. In the 1950s, he was every woman's dream. But let's face it, the guy wasn't a great actor. He had a limited range, a stiff delivery, and more charm than ability. Still, Curtis found himself starring alongside the greats, landing iconic roles in films like Some Like It Hot. What kept him in the game wasn't his acting. It was his magnetic presence, the way he filled a screen without saying much. But here's the shocking part. Curtis wasn't just playing a character on screen. Behind the scenes, he was struggling with personal demons, including his tumultuous marriage to Janet Leigh and his own inner conflict. The charm that made him a star was also the very thing that hid the cracks in his personal life. Curtis's story is the story of Hollywood itself, a carefully crafted illusion, a product designed to sell, not to feel. Now let's turn to someone whose acting was often overshadowed by her outrageous beauty. Jane Russell. Jane Russell wasn't just a pretty face. She was the definition of sultry. In Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, her performance was nothing short of iconic, but let's not kid ourselves. It wasn't her acting that made her unforgettable. It was her curves, her boldness, her ability to light up a scene with her charm. Hollywood didn't want Jane Russell to act. They wanted her to exude sex appeal, to play the part of the bad girl who tamed the screen. Her acting, often stiff, forced, and unconvincing. But nobody cared. She was the product of a Hollywood system that traded depth for mass appeal, a system where looks mattered more than skill. Russell's personal life reflected her on-screen persona, tumultuous, passionate, and filled with drama. And just like her roles, she had a complicated history with Hollywood. A history that shows the industry's appetite for beauty over substance. The next star on our list took Hollywood's obsession with physicality to a whole new level. Glenn Ford. Glenn Ford spent his career playing reliable leading men, but let's be honest, the guy wasn't a great actor. He didn't have the emotional depth of someone like Brando or Montgomery Clift, but he was always there, in the background, holding the screen with his solid presence. Ford was often cast in roles that didn't demand much. He was the guy who could deliver a line, look good in a suit, and not mess up a scene. But when it came to range, forget it. The emotional highs and lows that made other actors stand out were nowhere to be found in Ford's performances. Yet, he continued to land major roles in films like Gilda and The Big Heat. His appeal fueled more by his consistency than his ability to act. Ford's story is a testament to how Hollywood used an actor's reliability and physical presence to keep them in the game, regardless of talent. But the reality of the industry meant that even stars like Ford had to contend with the loneliness that often came with fame, something that would come crashing down in the next segment. Robert Taylor. Robert Taylor was one of the biggest stars of Hollywood's golden age, but let's be real, his acting was often as wooden as a plank. Despite starring in epic films like Quo Vadis and Camille, his performances rarely broke out of the stoic, unemotional mold. He was handsome, sure, but his performances didn't leave much room for the depth that audiences craved. So why did he continue to rise to the top? Because Hollywood knew how to sell him. They packaged Taylor as a man's man, a dashing hero with a chiseled jawline, even if his on-screen presence was more about looks than performance. Taylor's career shows how the studio system worked tirelessly to build a star, even when talent was lacking. His appeal wasn't in his acting, it was in his ability to fill a frame with an image that audiences wanted to believe. But even the brightest stars have shadows, and Taylor's personal life was filled with them, shadows that are revealed in the next actor's story. Ann Sheridan. Ann Sheridan was known as the Oomph Girl, but that was more about her allure than her acting. Hollywood adored her for her sultry presence and sharp comedic timing, but as an actress, she was often deemed inconsistent. In films like Angels with Dirty Faces, Sheridan played tough girls with heart, but her performances often lacked emotional depth. Hollywood used her sex appeal, her charm, and her quick wit, but never asked her to stretch her acting muscles too far. Sheridan's rise to fame wasn't about her ability to dig deep into her characters. It was about her ability to captivate, to make audiences feel something with just a glance. But there was more to her than that. Behind the glitz and glamour, Sheridan was fiercely independent, and like so many of her contemporaries, she dealt with her own struggles in an industry that cared more about the image than the woman behind it. Now let's move on to a man whose physical presence was a signature of his career, even if his acting was something else entirely. George Raft. George Raft was the epitome of the tough guy. Whether he was playing a gangster or a man of the streets, his presence was enough to demand attention. But let's be clear, Raft was no master of the craft. His acting was often criticized for being flat, robotic, and lacking emotional range. But despite this, Raft became one of Hollywood's most iconic tough guys, appearing in films like The Roaring Twenties and They Drive by Night. His secret? Hollywood loved his image. Raft was cast because he looked the part, and the part fit him so perfectly that audiences didn't care about the depth of his performance. The Hollywood system turned his lack of acting skill into an asset, transforming him into a star who didn't need to act. He just needed to be tough. But here's the kicker. Raft's real life mirrored his on-screen roles more than anyone knew. Rumor has it that he had connections to organized crime, a shadowy network that would ultimately keep him in the limelight for years. His career wasn't built on talent, it was built on connections, on image, and on the myth that the Hollywood machine created for him. And speaking of mythical figures, let's take a look at another star whose personal story would overshadow her professional one. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was the ultimate pinup girl, the glamorous red-haired siren whose beauty lit up screens across the world. But when it came to acting, Hayworth often fell short. Her performances were praised for their sensuality, but not for their emotional depth. Films like Gilda showcased her stunning beauty, but her acting was sometimes seen as forced, more about the image than the talent. But here's the truth. Hayworth's career was always about selling a fantasy. Hollywood didn't care if she could act. They cared if she could make men swoon, if she could capture the screen with nothing but a glance. But what most people didn't know was that Hayworth's personal life was far more complex than anything she portrayed on screen. Her struggles with mental health, including a battle with Alzheimer's in her later years, only added to the tragic layer of her story. Hayworth's beauty and tragic decline mirror the dark side of the Hollywood system, where stars were used, molded, and ultimately discarded when the public lost interest. Next, let's turn to another star whose career was built on his good looks rather than his acting prowess. William Holden. William Holden was the definition of cool, the suave, rugged hero that Hollywood adored. But when it came to acting, his range was often limited, his performances more about charm than depth. Films like Sunset Boulevard showcased his appeal, but they also highlighted his ability to carry a film with style, not acting brilliance. His career was less about his talent and more about his ability to seem effortlessly charismatic. Off-screen, however, Holden's personal life was filled with struggles. Alcoholism, failed relationships, and a sense of loneliness marred the image that Hollywood and audiences adored. The man who graced screens with such ease was, in reality, a figure constantly battling his demons. Holden's life was a perfect storm of Hollywood glamour and tragic undercurrents, a reminder that sometimes the stars we admire the most are the ones most deeply troubled. But let's now turn to a man whose career was not just about acting, or even charm, but about sheer physicality. Victor Mature. Victor Mature had the body of a Greek god, but when it came to acting, well, not so much. In films like Samson and Delilah, his towering physique made him an obvious choice for the role of the biblical hero. But the emotional depth required for the part? That was never quite there. Mature was cast because he looked the part. He didn't need to dig deep into character, he just had to stand there and look strong. His performances were often criticized for being wooden and lacking range, but his physical presence more than made up for it. Hollywood knew exactly what they were doing. Sell the body, not the acting. Mature's career proved that in the world of Golden Age Hollywood, being a pretty face was often enough to secure your place. But what made Mature even more fascinating was his attitude. He was never interested in being a great actor. He was happy just being a star. And that, in many ways, made him one of the most honest representations of the Golden Age, an era where image often trumped substance. That wraps up the list of top Golden Age actors who were terrible at acting but still got famous. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.